what exactly is bullying harassment? To understand that, the first thing to know is that as a workplace or as an employer, you have an active duty to make sure your workplace is free of bullying, harassment, and discrimination, which is understood a little differently in the workplace scenario as opposed to out in regular social setting. Bullying in the workplace center is seen as any sort of acts that are verbal, comments, physical acts that are meant to mentally hurt somebody or isolate them within the workplace. Sometimes bullying can also be physical, not just verbal. And usually it involves repeated incidents of this type of conduct, though sometimes even a single incident is enough to initiate a claim for bullying in the workplace. Some of the examples of workplace bullying you might see are spreading rumors about a colleague, or excluding them from social events, or if you have like a clique of people you like to eat lunch with, and then not letting, say, Matthew sit with you at lunch. That's not just schoolyard bullying, that's workplace bullying as well. Still just as hurtful. Any sort of comments with the intention of undermining someone's work, making them seen as inferior in the workplace, sabotaging them by hiding information, such as taking someone off of an email chain would be workplace bullying, or tampering with their belongings, going to their office and moving their photos around. That would be workplace bullying. That's typically colleague to colleague, but it also occurs employer to employee. These can be seen as undermining work performance, constantly telling them they're bad at their job when nothing could be further from the truth. Changing guidelines constantly. Again, employers are allowed to add and remove work as business needs change, but if you do it too frequently, it can be considered a little disruptive. Creating impossible deadlines or moving goalposts. If you give someone a task that takes 4 days to complete and you give them 12 hours to do it, that's bullying. And any sort of constant criticizing. As an employer, you have what's known as a due diligence, which is the standard, to make sure that you root out any sort of bullying in the workplace and make sure this doesn't occur. You need to make sure you take the precautions to keep a safe workplace environment that includes bullying. Now, not everything is considered bullying. Having a difference of opinion won't be bullying, such as deciding who's the best football team. It's not bullying. Or constructive feedback. This is a tricky one because constructive feedback is perfectly reasonable and sometimes very healthy and important in the workplace. But as an employer, you have to be mindful. Is my constructive criticism getting to the point of now just overly criticizing somebody? And as the employee, you need to watch that as well. A way to understand bullying is different from harassment and discrimination, as that bullying has this intentional component to it, whereas the person's intentionally trying to intimidate or undermine a colleague or an employee. Harassment is a bit different. You see, harassment, while can also be intentional, can also be completely unintentional. So harassment in the workplace is engaging in any sort of vexatious comment or conduct against a worker in the workplace that is known or ought to be known reasonably to be unwelcome. This is an important standard. Workplace harassment can be blatant or more nuanced, as in harassment can be something you can identify right away, but sometimes harassment is something that you don't easily identify. Harassment can occur over a single day or may occur over weeks to months. Typically, when our firm receives a complaint about somebody saying that they've been harassed at work, typically it's been going on for weeks or months. That's usually the case. But even a single bad day of harassment will reach that standard. Now, I mentioned before that the standard for harassment is unwanted comments that is known or ought to be known by a reasonable person. This can seem very subjective, as in, what ought to I know? What should I know? What does a reasonable person really know? It's a hard line, but generally speaking, in today's modern society, we take a much more liberal approach to that. And so generally, better safe than sorry. When you consider comments that are known to be offensive, best to err on the side of caution. Don't say something you know is going to be offensive, even if you're doing it in a comedic sense. Sometimes comedians will say a joke that they know is offensive to get a laugh. Save that for the comedy stage. Do not bring that to the workplace because you don't know who your listeners are. And if they find it to be harassing, then harassment's occurred. And saying that someone should just have thicker skin isn't going to be a viable defense. We do take a much softer approach here in employment law in Ontario and across Canada, where if it could be offensive, it is offensive. It's happened. Now, what a reasonable person ought to know to be harassment is a lot more nuanced and can be a lot harder for employees and employers to identify. Sometimes an employer can be guilty of harassment and have zero intention of hurting anybody or causing offense, zero intention or understanding that what they've said could be a hurtful offensive, and they're still guilty of workplace harassment. You see, it's not a viable defense to say you did not think what you said would be offensive, because again, bullying is the aspect that has intention, not workplace harassment. You don't necessarily need intention for workplace harassment to occur. What you need to know is, would a reasonable person find this offensive?